celebrating and showcasing extraordinary people who are doing incredible things to make our world a better place. This is Close Up Television. I'm your host, Jim Masters, and thanks for joining us. On today's episode, we celebrate Dr. Don Allen, clinical social worker, certified Emdr specialist, consultant, public speaker, certified Gottman Therapist, and founder of Columbia Counseling, Consulting, and Research, LLC. As one of the top certified Gottman Method therapists in the country, Dr. Allen has been on a mission to continue helping as many couples as possible build and maintain positive, healthy relationships. Based on the sound relationship house theory courtesy of John and Julie Gottman, Dr. Allen also utilizes intervention strategies like EFT and EMDR. Research shows that couples who participate in fun and research-driven activities can form a stronger relationship bond. With couples confused, overwhelmed, and frustrated from the effects of the pandemic and world events, through Dr. Allen's extraordinary and life-changing workshops, couples can begin to move forward in the relationship with positivity and momentum. Now, to learn more about Dr. Allen's incredible work, he joins me in the Close Up Television studio for this exclusive interview. Dr. Allen, thanks so much for joining us here at Close Up Television, coming in the studio from Texas, flying up to be with us. We had such a terrific time on the Close Up radio series that I wanted to have you come here to the studio because I had, some more digging I wanted to do. I wanted to learn more about you, but also the fascinating work that you do. So thanks for taking time to visit us here today.
Well, and again, I just want to say that it's really great to actually sit down and talk with you. I know we've done the radio shows and we talked beforehand and all that, but for me to see you in person and frankly, I inadvertently or otherwise followed your career. I mean, I've heard you in your voice and I recognize your voice on some of the things, but also some of the podcasts that you've done and just, kind of seen you do things over time. So it's just really nice to actually get to sit down and hang out and talk a little bit about stuff. So yeah, it's nice.
Appreciate that. Very fascinated, when I have the opportunity to converse with guests, to learn more about what makes them tick and sort of humanize them, make them relatable for our viewers. And in this case, I'm fascinated by some of the reasons why you decided to go into this line of work. What were some of those aha inspirational moments for you on your own life's journey that pointed you in the direction of realizing that you not only love what you do, but you have to do this work because it's in your DNA. Tell us about that inspiration.
Well, and it's interesting how life happens with that. I was at college and I just finished a major in music and I took a psychology course. And it was, I remember it now, it's an abnormal psychology course and I really had to get permission to get into it. But when I was in that course, the professor called me down after our midterms and he said, can you come to my office? So naturally I thought I was in trouble. You follow me? It's like, oh no, did I plagiarize? What's going on? But what he said was, look, my doctoral students read your midterm and they gave it to me and they said, have you ever considered a career in psychology? And I said, no. I said I was fascinated with it because I took a course in high school, but not really. And he goes, well, you really should. So actually, they actually recruited me into, because I had a lot of courses to take still. I was only my sophomore year. But that's how I got into this field. And one of the things that happened is that I got into a postgraduate psychology program. But what happened is that I was talking to the professors and they say, Don, we do a lot of psych testing and all that, but you really like culture. You really like ethnicities, you really like, women's studies, you like all these things. You really ought to consider social work. So I actually left a psych program to go to social work. Wow. And when first day I got into social work, my passion has always been marriage, right? So I mean, my career, a lot of what I did was children and adolescents. I'm published in that. But also drug alcohol. I was teaching at universities, drug alcohol, those types of things. But around 2012, I got to an age where I said, no, I want to do what I really love most. And that's marriage. And then from the marriage, I realized a lot of marriages have trauma, emotional trauma. So I got a specialty in both of those, and I kind of dropped, the specialties of drug, alcohol, and children and adolescents, although I still see people. But that's really kind of taken me on this whole journey of mental health. But I've always loved what I do. Sometimes people say, Don, how do you not burn out? That's a tough field.
Yeah.
I really enjoy the people I'm working with. They get better, and they really generally tend to really appreciate all the work we've done. And then again, I found modalities, like the Gottman Method, that really work. So if people do what we're giving them, and with the genius of John and Julie Gottman, that really works. And then I also went ahead and got my certification in emotion-focused therapy, and then I was teaching the Emdr anyway. So with those three things, I find I can really help people. So I think that's one of the reasons I get excited, because I'm not having trouble because people aren't getting better. So.
Right, exactly. I'm fascinated by the fact that you made the focus marriage and relationships and couples, and that's an interesting dynamic. You mentioned, and I mentioned it in the introduction, the expertise with the Gottman Method. Tell us what that actually is and how you apply it to your work.
Well, the Gottman Method is a highly scientifically driven way of looking at relationships. It looks at relationships, and what they've done through their research is they've made this very accessible to the people that are coming in for help. So we have this thing called the Relationship House, and it has a lot of metaphors with it. And with those metaphors, we can help a couple kind of notice that. Like, for example, the bottom three of the Relationship House is the Friendship House. Right? It's a friendship house. Well, kind of what do you mean by that, Don? Well, the first part of it is love maps. And love maps are just knowing your partner's internal world, what's important to them, right? So if Mother's Day is coming up, you kind of know what really makes them go, wow, boy, what a great Mother's Day. You kind of know that. Well, that's love maps.
Yeah.
And then the other thing we find is with couples, you have to have a certain amount of bids that are accepted. You have to turn towards them. Right? So that's the third level of the Friendship House, right? And we know masters marriages, the people that really do this well. And most people really have somebody in their life, they say, they have a great marriage, or they know somebody in the neighborhood or whatever. So those kind of folks make those bids successfully 86% of the time. It's pretty amazing. You need to have a minimum of 33% of those bids, or you're going to start going into what I call attachment distress. You're going to feel like your partner's not there, and then you're going to start to really get upset. 9 to 19%, that's divorce court.
It is.
So you really have to keep that marriage house. The middle one is really important to me. It's the fondness and the admiration for a person. If you ever ask somebody, tell me about your wife, tell me about your husband, tell me about your partner, your person, and they look and they go, oh my gosh, and you start listening to a talk, and you just know they really like that person.
Yeah.
And that is so important, because that's the energy that you get to really help a couple, right? So the first one's the Friendship House. The middle part is the Conflict House. This is where, how do people resolve conflict? Now, right in between those two, and we actually try to figure out which one it goes into more, the Friendship House or the Conflict House, but it's the positive perspective. When something goes wrong, do we just kind of assume, well, it's nothing, it's probably fine, that happened, it was annoying, but my person would never do that.
Or is it? Right.
Yeah, exactly. Or do you start collecting them? Do you start to say, here we go again?
So it starts, you're making a list, building up this list of...
Yeah, I'm going to come home, I bet it's going to be bad. Uh-oh. That's what we call the negative overriding sentiment. So what we do is we use the Conflict House and the Friendship House to make sure that we stay in the positive perspective. The upper part of the Relationship House is really where our beliefs and what's important to us live, right? So those two are make each other's dreams come true, right? And then the other part is shared meaning. How do we roll? I always say to people, what do you want to say when you're 80? When you sit there and you're at a family reunion and you tap your person and say, look at that, we did that, right? But what happens with those belief systems is sometimes they clash. So we have to have a system to really help people dialogue those problems rather than get into that gridlock, right?
So what are some of the common threads that you see in relationship issues with marriages specifically. Is there like a top 5 list? Well, most people deal with this and they're frustrated with this, and the problem usually stems from that. Do you find a thread, a repeated scenario with some of this? So it's not a cookie cutter approach, one size fits all. Everybody has their unique dynamics of personality, individuality, and upbringing, cultural, all these things that come into play. But specifically, do you find a few things that just, it's a human thing between this person and that person as some of the top things they deal with?
Well, what's fun about that is I do think there are trends in society. We just went through COVID, right? So COVID is co-varying with...
Brought in a whole new thing,
Boy, one thing I'm proud about my profession and people like me is, everybody is just trying to do the best they can to meet the mental health needs of the community. And I'm very proud of us. And it can be overwhelming like other things, and we've seen that. But I think, so you get into some trends, but what we find from research is, and this is interesting, 69% of the things couples have trouble with cannot be solved.
They cannot be solved.
Not be solved. We call them perpetual problems.
And are they usually issues that one has with one's self versus, say, for example, it's me and then it's the other person? Is it usually my issue, or am I sort of turning that on to the other person? How does that work?
Well, you kind of are getting into what one kind of makes us annoyed, but then we also can get into what our belief systems are. And those are two very different ways of managing conflict. But let me give you one. We've talked, and Junko, my wife, and she's Japanese. I met her at Columbia University, and we've been married for 28 years. But there are things to this day that we can't figure each other out. I mean, it's really interesting. Let me kind of give
cultural upbringing and just a lot of different things that are, you get set in your ways just based on how you were raised and your thought process that come into play where there's no budging.
Yeah, well, but it's also in your operation system,
like
if
DNA
you will.
Almost.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, when you're born and you are raised in a certain way of thinking, it becomes part of you and not just how you think. And think of how different America is from Japan. Now think, again, I grew up in Ohio Midwest. Well, how is that different? So you start really having a lot of those. Let me give you an example that I think it was a cool way to do this, right? But we watched the movie Midway. There was an old one, but this is the newer one. And one of the things they did at this movie that she and I particularly liked watching is that a lot of the stars that she watches all the time on her television shows, because she likes to watch Japanese TV, she knows them. So they not only got big stars from America, but they got the name brand people from Japan. And the other thing I like about the movie is both sides were heroes. They were just trying to honor their country and protect their life and protect their fellow soldiers. So there wasn't, I mean, some of these old movies, I think, the other side was bad, the other side was good. But that wasn't the way I at least saw it. I mean, some people may see it different. But what was great about that movie for us is after the movie, we started talking about what it was like for the Japanese to be drafted into that. What it was like for America. What was the mindset of America? What was going on? For example, one thing she said is if they came to your house and knocked on your door, and let's say your younger brother was 18, and all of a sudden they say, congratulations, you get to go serve the emperor. The expectation was, oh my gosh, thank you. Even if you absolutely were like, I want to run. But that's expected in that society. And then she was talking about, just kind of how the cultural was from the smaller cities and the bigger cities. And I was able to talk about, kind of how America was at that time from the way I remembered it. But it was really great for us to talk about that because it highlights kind of what I just said, which is perpetual problems. When we talk to each other and she filters through that and I filter through that, some of that stuff, to this day, we can't get our mind around it, right? It just doesn't make sense. So perpetual problems are just going to happen. They're inefficiencies in how you communicate. Gridlock problems, which are in the perpetual problems, are where if you if you cave in, if you give in, you really are betraying yourself. You're really betraying what you believe in. So when you've got two people that are really holding on to what they believe in, they fight up here. They fight up here.
Yeah.
But what they're really fighting about is their belief system. And we see that a lot in our society today, right? And then you take things like COVID, that can really make people closer, but it can also push down on the problems they have.
Right.
So this is where it really depends. And I haven't even gotten into culture. The difference is how men and women see it, the difference in how Midwest versus the East or West Coast, religious view. Oh my goodness. So all of those things are opportunities for ineffective communication. So when you ask me the question, you know, are there trends and stuff? One of the things I kind of think of when you say it is it really depends on the person in front of me, right? But most people really want to be friends and they really want to love their people and they really want to find a way to feel very seen by their person. They want to feel safe when they bring something to somebody. They want it's safe to come and talk to you, you know? It's soothing when I bring a problem. Even if we're in conflict, I want to feel like I can do that. And then the positive overriding sentiment. It's secure. I can do this. I don't have to worry. And when good relationships are happening, these things move freely.
Right.
But you're going to have these opportunities where you didn't hear somebody, or you've got this belief system problem. So that's what I find. I find that, you know, if you look 20 years ago or 50 years ago with a relationship, if you want to look at the gay community, if you want to look at the lesbian community, you know, if you want to look at different ethnicities and stuff, you know, by and large, people want to attach to the people they love with, right? And in order to do that, they have to manage this relationship house. So what I do is I can use that relationship house sort of like a compass to kind of guide a couple to where they want to be.
What about when you hear a lot of people say, oh, you know, when they're dating and they're getting ready to marry, there might be a few things they don't like about that person, or their annoyances, or there's just the belief system isn't matching theirs. But once they marry them, they can sort of reframe them, they can mold them, they
or
can
fix
change
them, or
they can soften things and, you know, sort of dust things off, polish the other person up to meet them at their level of thinking. That's a big mistake, isn't it? You can't mold people. You can't. People have the belief systems they have. You know, you can't completely rearrange somebody's way of thinking in their life to match yours, right? Because sometimes people think, oh, well, once we're together, that's it. Now I'm going to really get to work on him or her.
Well, yeah. I mean, what you're going to do is get into your 69% perpetual problems. So what you need to do is have
69. That's a lot.
I thought it was. You know, when I first heard that, I was guessing. I was not expecting
that money. That was a top 10. Wow.
Wow. Yeah. So well, let's say you want to fix somebody, okay? But here's the thing. You know, you've got to work with a system that you can dialogue about your problem. So what you're going to find with that is you're going to find areas of inflexibility. I'm not going to change my mind on that, right? You know, let's say somebody's very religious. I am not going to miss church on Sunday. No, because that would be really dishonoring God. They would not necessarily want to do it. But if I'm saying, hey, I'm going to get married and then I'll talk about it in church, I don't think that's going to happen. But what you can do is talk about areas of inflexibility, but also areas of flexibility. All right. So let's say you're really religious and you want me to go to church every Sunday. You know, I may say, look, I'll go to church with you every other Sunday. How about that? You know, well, I really would like you to go all the time, but you know what? If you're willing to go with me and that, but you know what? I'm flexible on that, but I'm inflexible afterwards. I want to go to lunch. I want to go out and have lunch with you because I really haven't seen you all week, and I just want to put our cell phones away, and I just want to have time with you. Those bids, you hear it?
Right.
So that's where people can begin to, rather than change people, if you will, is to kind of be able to negotiate that. Now, one of the things I hope people do before they commit, like in a marriage or whatever, is they really learn those areas of inflexibility that frankly would be deal breakers. If somebody doesn't want to have children and somebody wants to have 10, and you're not going to yield on 10, and you're not going to yield on, those are the kind of things you probably want to kind of figure out before you really commit to somebody in a way, because part of a lot of times with marriage, it's literally a marriage. You're marrying beliefs, you're marrying dreams. You want to make each other's dreams come true. So if certain things are that important to you, right, you probably want to screen that earlier. The other side of it is, let's say somebody thinks it's a great idea to have a meth lab in the basement. Well, I'm going to want to screen that out, because not only do I not want that, but if somebody thinks that's a good idea, that's probably a deal breaker for me. So part of what dating should be, part of what, getting connected with people should really be, is this the kind of person I want to have a life and a lifestyle with? And there's a lot of lifestyles out there. That's one of the things we're really learning. I mean, I was just kind of having fun. I didn't have a chance to normally just read and play, and I was doing that yesterday. But I was looking over census data because I'm really boring, and I was looking at the trends of how things have changed over time. And what struck me from the 2021 data is how many more people are living alone. Right now, some people living alone doesn't mean they're lonely. They just like being alone. Some people, they're going to want to be around people. They're going to want to have people in their life. But you're going to get the whole bell curve with that. So, you could either have, this is great, or we have a mental health crisis and everything in between.
Why do you think they're choosing to live alone?
I think there's a lot of factors with that. But yeah, what was interesting about that to me is when you looked at like 1949, I think it was 88% of the people, yeah.
It was like expected as part of the culture, part of the ritual, part of the society. You will get married, you'll have the children, the dog, the station wagon, and a 35-year career at the company, and then retire and go to Boca Raton.
Yeah, there you go. No, that was the idea, right? Back in those days, work 50 years in the same job, get a watch.
Right.
Remember?
Right.
No, I remember. Again, I'm old enough. I remember that was ahead of me, but I remember those careers.
From home now, which brings in a whole new dynamic since the pandemic. Everybody working, there in the house. It's a whole new thing, right?
Oh, and what I like to do when I read all these statistics is I think back to when I was in school. When I was in school, and again, when I say this, okay, white, middle class, Ohio, right? But if you talk to an ethnicity, if you talk to an urban ethnicity, if you talk to females, what was the expectation at the time? I remember for me, and nobody really ever talked about it in college, but there was this kind of understanding in the family or whatever. By the time you were a senior, you're kind of getting engaged. I mean, you kind of did that. Back when I was younger, my consciousness was to get a career and move forward. I didn't worry that much or think about how much my wife was going to make or what her career was. And I probably should have, but this is my mindset. You know what I'm saying?
That you were going to be the breadwinner, you were going to be the, right.
But that's, okay, back to what I said about my wife and I talking about what was expected in the community, right? And that's what happens. People go along in life and this is their consciousness, right?
They just follow the patterns.
Yeah. But I remember I talked to my sister, who's 8 years older than I. I have 3 sisters, but I talked to her one time a long time ago. And she said something very interesting to me when I was in my 30s. And what she said was, Don, if you weren't engaged by the time you finished college, the word spinster was flying around. Now that's an interesting word, let alone, and that's only 8 years difference, you see. But now when you talk to people, if we had somebody here and they were 25, what is the expectation? Well, the census figures really are reporting now that back in close to 1950, women were getting married, median, right? Were getting married at 20, men were 22. Now it's 29 for women, I think, 28 or 29 for women, and it's like 32 for men. And then when you look at the number of, for example, African American men, that number has jumped from like 42% never married in 1980. I'm trying to remember these numbers, to now it's 52%. And the same thing with women. It's lower, more women get married, but the same trend. So, then I love what your question is. I wonder how come, but this is why I like doing the Gottman Method or the EFT method, because if this was 40 years from now, this stuff's still going to work. Because, what you're talking about is getting people dialoguing about where they are, right? And back to the gay and lesbian community, we find that the relationship house is just as good a metaphor for them. Different ways of relating, but by and large, how are we going to dialogue problems? How are we going to stay friends? How are we going to look at what's important to our person? How do we keep the trust in our relationship and strengthen the commitment? This is what I'm constantly doing every time I see somebody in my office.
They say that the divorce rate is higher than ever, and that we're living in a disposable society. The minute we don't like something, we get rid of it. We toss it out, whatever it is, the shirt, the car, anything. The spouse, we just sort of, oh, I don't like this, and this about that person. I can't deal with it. I can't handle it. I'm out. I'm out of here. What is it about this disposable society mindset that we've got, with this divorce rate as high as it is? Why is everybody so willing? Like you heard years ago stories of, oh, well, maybe there was some trouble in the marriage, but they stayed together for the sake of the children, different things.
And you still hear that.
You still hear that for the sake of the children and things of that nature. And then split from there. Sometimes it's still shocking when you hear a couple that's been married 65 years and then they divorce.
Yeah.
People most will say, you had 65 years, you didn't understand, he left the seat up or didn't put the cap on the toothpaste, the little things that people complain about. But it is a disposable society, people say. How come we seem to be so comfortable with just not wanting to work it out, not investigating ways to repair, and just like, I'm done, I'm out, next.
Yeah. What's interesting, when you say that, I kind of go to it depends. But let me give you some examples. I went to Catholic school when I was a kid. And I remember one of the nuns when I was like in 5th grade really proud that the Catholics had less than a 3% divorce rate. We don't divorce, and they're very proud of it. In 1974, they introduced new legislation. And what happened is prior to that, when you divorced, it was like Exxon suing BP.
Yeah.
It was adversarial, and if you were amicable but needed a divorce, a lot of times by the time you finished that, you hated each other.
Yeah.
So, the prevailing wisdom says we need to do something. And I remember the term, I haven't heard it in a long time, but the term was no-fault divorce. And then you could divorce for mild things like irreconcilable differences. And when that happened, that was the record year for divorces. We've never had more divorces filed in 1 year than that. What I'm finding is that, my cohort, people my age, actually divorced at a higher rate than if I look at my son or my daughters. But one of the things I notice, I think, is that a lot of people that age, they went through a divorce. When I was working in the school systems, because I worked for like 12 years, you started seeing more and more divorced families. And I was seeing them, right? Because I was that school person where if you had a problem, you came see me. But more and more in the school, you started seeing these kids that were a part of that. So these kids grew up, and they don't want to put kids in this world necessarily, unless it's going to make it. So when they marry, their divorce rate is a lot lower, because I think that cohort that is marrying is mindful. Now that's just one example. There's a lot of things that I can talk about. The other thing that I think is important is people aren't necessarily getting married, but they do cohabitate. What we find from attachment theory is people want to be with that person. The first day of your life when you're born, right, you're completely helpless, and you don't know anything from anything. So your biology, years, hundreds of million years of evolution, says look to your mom and dad's eyes. Look. And once you start going back and forth, that exchange in 1/100th of a second slices begin to form how a kid feels about the world, how a kid grows up and thrives. When you fall in love, when you go, and this is my person, it's like first day of your life 2.0, you start to bond in much the same ways. And I'm talking medically, biochemically. So when something happens to weaken that bond, we don't know what to do. So a lot of times we start using these maladaptive ways of fighting. Maybe this is what we saw when we grew up. Maybe we just don't have that. So one of the things people do is they come to me and they say, Don, can you help us? Well, statistically, we know that these people should have been there 7 years earlier. The other thing, and this will probably blow your mind, people when they come in are 4 standard deviations below the mean in marital satisfaction. That's where you're starting as a clinician.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, so what you have to do is you have to teach this skill set, and you have to build that friendship house again. And you have to help people slow down so they can understand what's important and those gridlock issues. So this is where, when people come to see us, and usually when people come to see me in my office, they're pretty pleasant and cordial, but I can just see they're nervous. Am I going to lose my person? Is this person not going to like me? You can see it. And then usually after the assessment, and usually, I don't know, several sessions in, they come in and it's like, that's my person. I'm with them. That's my partner.
No, are they coming in usually as a couple? Are they coming in individual to see you, or is it group situations? The 2 coming in?
2 coming in, I treat, not only, this is important, I treat the couple, but I see the couple as a couple. I don't see individuals.
Right.
I see the couple. Now that doesn't mean I can't talk to individuals, but there are no secrets. If you tell me something, that's fair game. But the other side of it is I treat the relationship. So for example, if you were here with your person and you were saying, well, Don, let me tell you what happened last night. I'll say, tell her. Right. You tell her and I'll listen. I want you 2 to be talking constantly. I want you 2 to get used to looking at each other and talking.
Because sometimes they filter it, try to filter it through you to get your answer. What your answer is what she should be saying or what he should be saying, and you want them to really filter it, bounce it off you, but filter it with each other.
Yeah. But here's the other thing too. Sometimes they're hurting so bad that I have to say, well, tell me. Okay, now tell them I'm going to help you. I'm going to help you, and we're going to work together on it, right? Or did you hear what they just said? How do you think they're feeling right now? What do you think the feelings are happening in the room? Because slowing it down so people can really understand, wow, your partner's really hurting here.
Because sometimes they come in all hyped and
they're
ready to fire, right? Well, you and this and this, and you're not listening to me.
Right.
And blah,
now,
blah, blah.
Those are the 4 horsemen. Right now, one of the things we do know is when people don't make it, because you were saying earlier, that's it, I'm out of this, whatever.
That's what they say, yeah.
But what you're seeing is these 4 things that people do keep happening and keep happening. And then there's a medical condition that happens in the body. It's got a fancy name. It's called diffuse physiological arousal. But what it is that your brain completely disengages the thinking part and goes to reactive brain, which is your limbic system. And you have to stop, right? And I always tell people, when you're flooded, you immediately call a timeout. And people have code names for it, right? They may say like at the hospital, code blue when you get the crash card. What it means is you drop what you're doing and, okay. And my joke with that is, so when somebody says that, you don't finish your sentence because you're flooded. So you don't say, "and the horse you rode in on," because that was coming next.
That was next.
But if you say that, think of how that's already going to ramp up somebody who's already flooded.
Yeah.
So what you do is you stop, and then you need a 35-minute timeout, and you have to do certain things to get all those chemicals out of your body so that your brain re-engages. And then I always say, come back. Don't go back to the conflict necessarily, right? Especially if you're at home. Go to repair. How do you repair? Well, this is what I did wrong. I'm sorry. And the other person, you know what? I could have done better with this. Or when I flooded, I completely lost it. I'm sorry. But I also say to people, when somebody says they're sorry, accept the apology. I'm really sorry I didn't do that. Well, you should be. No.
Yeah.
No.
Right.
It's thank you for saying that. Thank you for noticing that that hurt my feelings. Because a lot of people, what they're fighting about isn't what they're fighting about. They're fighting that you don't see that I'm hurting and you're my person and you mean more to me than anybody else in the world and you hurt my feelings and you're not noticing that you hurt my feelings and I'm so upset and I'm freaking out because you don't see my pain. And the other person says, well, you don't see my pain.
My pain. Or they'll say something like, well, what do you think I'm a rocket scientist? I can't figure it all out, or I can't, you're not giving me enough signals, or I'm not a magician, I can't.
Right. So those would be...
And then it gets shut down.
Those would be criticism. That's one of the horsemen, right? You're not seeing... See, hear the you? You're not, right, and then fill in the blank. Now, if you describe your partner in a way that puts them down, do you remember, I'm going to people in the audience may not remember these things, but there was a show on a long time ago called All in the Family.
Oh, yeah. Archie and Edith. And
Yeah.
sure.
Well, bless you for remembering.
Norman Lear.
Yeah, but what Archie used to say is he used to say, stifle yourself, Edith, stifle yourself, you're a dingbat.
Dummy up.
That's a contempt. That's a contempt. That is the number one predictor of when divorce happens. You cannot describe your partner in a way that says not only that they're bad, but they're defective. And the other thing you're doing, if you do that, if you think about it, you're putting yourself in a position of authority over your partner. Well, that's arrogant.
Yeah.
You know, right? I always laugh. I'm not going to get into a contest with Junko because she's a lot better person than I am. So if I'm sitting there doing that, boy, I hate to have her go, let's talk about yours, Don. So back to humble and grateful. I'm just grateful, and I need to settle down. If I'm to that point, I need to settle down, and I need to remember all the great things. But here's the other thing we do. This is the antidote for contempt. Rather than describe your partner, right? When you do this, it makes me feel this. What I need from you instead is that. You know, right? When I was so disappointed you didn't put gas in the car. And you know what? I was wondering if I was going to get home. And it really made me scared that I was on the road without gas. And I kept thinking, you know, I asked you to get gas.
Yeah.
And I don't know, did you ignore me? Did you forget? I don't know what. But it made me so upset. What I need you to do is just really be mindful not to put me in a position where I'm on the road without gas. Right. So that's describing, rather than say, you know why you forgot the gas? It's because A, B, C, D. So you've got to not do that. You've got to not do that. And then usually when you do that, people upregulate, they flood.
Oh, yeah. And they start shooting out lists. Well, remember the time, and I also want to tell you that I don't like when you do this and say this, and they list all these things that maybe they never brought up before, maybe little idiosyncrasies that did irk that person, but all of a sudden they just, like ammo, just
here we go.
Gunfire comes straight at them. Yeah. This, and and also sometimes you see where they'll, if this doesn't work, if this doesn't get the reaction, then they'll come at them a different way with some more ammunition until they wear them down to where they give in or give up. Right. And that's crazy stuff. Yeah.
Well, and if you use any of the four horsemen, 83% of the time what's coming next is bad. So unless you're feeling really lucky today, 83% of the time the fight's going to digress. And then the other thing is what you just described is another horseman, which is what I call defensiveness or defensive responding.
Right.
Well, you didn't do this. Well, you didn't do that.
It's back and forth.
And you heard the voice. Well, you. So now all of a sudden, all of these emotions are upregulating. And then the other thing is we're just all over the place. We're not talking about one thing anymore, right? So you can see if I say, slow down, when you do this, I feel this, what I need is that. Tell your partner. Look at your partner. Non-defensive, slow down. We always say all of this is under the umbrella of gentle startup.
Exactly.
Always say it nice. Always say it nice.
Right.
This is your person.
This is the person. Right.
Now, I'll bet you, Jim, if you think about it, how many times have you know all this? I mean, what I'm saying, you're agreeing because it's like you're right, Don. How many times have you known all this, but you got in a fight anyway?
Right, exactly, yes. You know what is a trigger for me with anything, and just in everyday dealing with, people? Tone. I'm very big with tone because I'm very conscious of my tone and keeping my tone regulated, warm, welcoming, inviting. But sometimes when the other person has a tone that's very argumentative or offensive, blunt, opinionated without even being asked for their opinion and just totally stripping it down. That usually would be something for me. We could have a really good, deep conversation where we don't necessarily agree, and we come from our different belief systems and everything else. The one thing for me that all bets are off is the tone that's being presented.
Yeah. Thank you. No, absolutely. Absolutely. It's that nonverbal stuff, right? And then let me add some things, when I talk about perpetual problems, right? What if you're just a naturally sensitive person?
Yeah.
I kind of am. I think a lot of people I know in my field are. So now I'm sensitive and I just got hit with a tone and I got hit with negativity. Or maybe I got, and another,
whammy.
And by the way, while I'm on the subject, another thing you do wrong So now you start getting a succession of these, which is criticism. And that's another one of the horsemen. But I like how with you, back to your I need statements is, it's really important we have that gentle start up, but please, one of the things I need is don't start up in the tone, because that's going to make me want to get defensive.
Respond.
Yeah, no, so you got, so we got 3 of the horsemen just by chatting, right?
Because when the tone is evident, then my tone changes.
Yes.
Then my tone becomes...
Yeah, 83% of the time. That's right.
Yeah.
Isn't that weird? We even know the science of how often it happens.
Yeah.
Right? Because this is based on like 40 years of research. I mean, like I said, if 100 years from now somebody's doing this work, right, this stuff's still going to apply, because it's attachment theory. It's got to do with how the body relates to feeling when my partner isn't there for me. I go into danger.
What if you're somebody who wants to, you're having a little bit of a squabble, whatever it may be, and you are the one that really wants to talk through it, talk it out, come at it in a lot of different ways to just figure out what it is that's driving this, and the other person doesn't want to. The other person runs away or disappears or just doesn't want to do that.
Right.
I remember somebody years ago when I was, right out of school, and we had dated. And if there was ever any sort of a disagreement or just not understanding of each other, she would, if she didn't think I was agreeing, what she used to say was, and I found this fascinating, and I've applied it, in regular conversations with people, she would say, if I wasn't agreeing with what she was saying, she would say, "You're not listening. You're not listening." And I said, "Believe me, I'm an incredibly deep listener. I could probably repeat everything you just said upside down and backwards. It's not that I'm not listening. I just don't agree. So the fact that I'm not agreeing doesn't mean I'm not listening."
Right.
But to her, that meant I was not listening to her because I wasn't agreeing with her.
Yeah.
And then she sometimes, when we would have a disagreement on something, would go in the bathroom, lock the door, and run the water so she couldn't hear me talk.
Yeah.
And I said, "Don't you want to talk it out? Because I think if we keep chatting, we're going to probably say that was dumb, that little thing we squabbled over, and we're going to end up laughing." Because there were times that would happen. If we went long enough, we'd end up laughing about how crazy that little thing was. But yet she would shut it down and go in another room, run the water, lock the door, and not let you finish trying to connect and solve it. How frustrating that
can be. Well,
and that's why my father happened to be there once. He said, "Are you sure you know what you're doing?"
Well, and you can get that frustrated, can't you? Yeah.
And then my mother wouldn't say anything because she said, "Well, what happens if you guys solve it? Then she won't like me."
Yeah.
But the dad was, "You sure you know what you're doing?"
Yeah. Well, and you just happened on the last horseman, which is called Stonewalling, right? It's talk to the hand.
Yes.
And what I always say when people do that, your antidote to that is to go settle down and come back. If you don't come back, it's still more of a stonewall. But here's a lot of times how we handle that. I talked to you a little bit about having a belief system argument. Okay, so we have a special way of intervening. So we move from gridlock to dialogue. But what you're talking about here has to do with feelings and needs, right? It doesn't necessarily have to do with a belief system. Oh my gosh, I wanted to get cereal this morning and we have no milk. I need to have milk. Please, remember the story. Needs and wants. But I do think it's important, when people do go and they stonewall, they have to settle down and they have to come back. But what we do is we have a special way of discussing this, and we either call it aftermath of a fight or a regrettable incident, right? So that can happen after a big fight or something we just need to dialogue. But one of the parts in that is something we call the rapport, right? And the rapport was actually invented for countries to talk so they can get out of war. But we find that it's a highly effective method, and John and Julie adapted that into their methodology. But what happens is it gives people a chance to go back and forth. So what happens is that, let's say she's talking to you and you're taking notes. Some people can keep it in their head. Some people talk in paragraphs. You got to kind of know. But what you want to do is make sure that you get their points down, right? So when they're done and they say, okay, so that's my point of view, what you say to them is, what I hear you saying. And again, what you just said, say it nice, no tone. We call it non-defensive responding, right? We use the attunement technique with that. But, what I hear you say, and then once you get that all done, you say to them, did I get it all? And they go, yeah, I think you did. Or they might say, tell me a little bit more about this part. Oh, okay, well, when you were talking about this part, what I heard you say was, but eventually people feel that they're heard, right? Seen, soothed, safe, secure, I say. They're heard, right? And that's very soothing to know. So then what you say is, it makes sense to me. It makes sense to me that you would think that. But now let me say something. Just because you say it makes sense to me doesn't mean you agree with it.
Right.
But this part of it makes sense to me. And we always tell people, find at least one part that it makes sense to. What I like to do with couples, because that's kind of the rapport, but what I like to do is add something to the rapport. Now, I don't know that they do this at the Gottman Institute, but one of the things I like to do is afterwards say some kind of inclination of fondness. And that is so like you because, you're really caring and you really want this to be just right. And I just love the fact that you're like that you want this. Give them something that lets them know that they're in the club and you're not voting them off the island. But then what happens is, once that's all done, now you get to say yours. And they write. Now, sometimes what happens in my office is somebody goes, yeah, but. And I go, no. This is your time to interview and report back, right? Right? But it's very important that you do that because then, one, you're not meandering to another argument. Two, you're showing up. You're not stonewalling. You're not leaving the room. Three, you're doing it in a gentle way so there's not criticism, right? And in criticism, the antidote to that is gentle responding, just gentle startup. And then defensiveness, take responsibility. When you said that, I got upset, and I could have said it better, I'm sorry. Saying something that lets your partner know, wow, you get my pain here, thank you. And then you're their most important person. You show up.
Right.
No, it's huge that you show up, especially when you're in conflict. The interesting thing I want to say about that too is that what we know from research is that trust is built with conflict. It's conflict resolution because even though you and I get really mad at each other, we can work it out and then we're close again because we go back to the friendship house and repair. And I can even have regrettable incidences. I can mess up. But at the end of the day, we have the conflict and we're close again. That's an extremely important part. What we find from research is that people who never argue, that just never have conflict, they eventually can start, not everybody, but they eventually can start describing their relationship as mundane, as kind of boring. And you haven't done anything to really say, we can work together. I mean, even think of the workplace. When people, you can mix it up, but at the end of the day, you kind of say, hey, we solved that problem. You begin to know and trust people, right? I think the military, I don't know much about it, but I think the military would be the epitome of this. You've got to put your life with them. You better be able to talk.
Right, protect each other.
Oh, I would think. Yeah. So anyway, the point is we have a method that if people kind of do what you're saying, a way of dialoguing it in a way that people can set it down. And then once you can do that, we have the regrettable incident way of doing that. And not to get into it too much now, but there's a 5-step process that we get. I know we actually, if you go to my website or go to yours, this is one of the radio shows that we talked about. So we do have that on there. But yeah, my point is we have these methods of getting conflict out of the way so that we can build the friendship house and restore kind of the erosion of what has happened to make people not become friends.
I'd like to break out some of these other methods that you use. EFT, tell us about that.
Yeah, emotion-focused therapy was something that just intrigued me. And I really pretty much use Gottman methodology. I find that the amount of research and the way I have these tools, But sometimes one of the things that I like to do is to do something different for couples. The other thing you need to know is sometimes people call up and say, Don, I want to do exclusively emotion-focused therapy. I've researched it. This is what I want. So
What is it actually?
well, emotion-focused therapy was developed by Susan Johnson out of Canada. And it is also a highly empirically driven, which means science backs it, and it works. And we know it works. And what happens with emotion-focused therapy is that if I'm doing emotion-focused therapy with you and your person, if I'm a minute ago or I'm a minute ahead, I'm not an EFT. I'm not an EFT. What happens is we only look at the emotion. So the theory behind it, also attachment theory, but what happens is that people go into emotional distress and the other person isn't seeing their pain. So what happens is they go into what Sue Johnson calls these predictable dances, and you'll have one of them. So what happens is you take turns upregulating your partner. And what they call, you throw bullets. You don't shoot them, but you throw bullets. And what happens is that keeps this upregulation. But you're fighting here. But what you're really fighting about is the underlying feelings, right? So what we want to do is we want to stop and see that dance as the enemy. So what happens is this. I say something to you. That's a behavior, right? I'm saying something. You...
How dare you?
Yes, yes. And well, maybe that happens. So what you would do if you say, I how dare you, which I love it. You did great.
Actually, you're the opposite. You're a good guy.
Well, I think everybody's a person, right? But what happens is that person listens to the behavior and they attribute something to it. Now, where the Gottman Method, we talk about meta-emotions, so meta-emotions are extremely important. What happens in the methodology for emotion-focused therapy is you go into what we have as what we call secondary emotions. Secondary emotions aren't secondary like they're lesser. They're secondary because they're feelings you feel after you feel something else. And they're usually like happy, sad, glad, mad, right?
Right.
So let's say you say something.
Remember, those from kindergarten.
Right,
They
that's
used to
what they
teach us
teach.
that back then.
Yes, and the basics, right? Right. But as you got older, what you probably noticed is they would teach you things like, I felt disappointed, I felt worried, I felt confused, I felt alone, I felt abandoned, I felt voted off the island, I felt not cared for, I felt just despair. These are feelings that might be fueling the anger. So all you're getting from me is anger. So that means, well, you're angry at me, I'm going to be, So what happens is that you give a behavior, right? Then I give an attribute to that behavior. I attribute something about you, about that behavior. Right. Go into those secondary emotions, right? I'm mad at you, but underneath it, what you're not seeing is I'm scared and lonely, and then that hits my abandonment. And then what I do is I come back up and I start with this. So I give you something, so now you attribute my harsh tone, right? So you're ready to fight. So now your harsh tone makes you angry or indignant, right? Or maybe sad. But what you're also doing is your primary feelings are kicking in. Now you're feeling worried. Maybe you're afraid that we aren't friends anymore. Well, if I'm not friends with Don, I really enjoy talking to Don. So now I'm feeling alone and abandoned. So I don't want to feel alone and abandoned. So now here we go into this dance, right? So what happens with emotion-focused therapy is I watch people go back and forth and I slow it down that much. So I might say, so when she said that, where did you go? Now you notice my voice drops because now I might be talking to a very flooded brain that is like freaking out. So I go, wait a minute, what did you experience? And you might say, well, it's just, did you notice your voice just changed? And I just slow it down right now in the moment. So then all of a sudden, let's say you start to cry. So I looked to your person and I said, what do you notice? Okay, so when that happened, what did you start experiencing right now? And we begin to go back and forth to see that. So what will happen a lot of times at the beginning is people will go right back into the dance.
Right.
Right? So what do you notice? They're crying. Well, I really don't care that they are crying. Well, I don't care that you're crying. It's right back into
back
that.
and forth, yeah.
But what happens is eventually people just get to where they're both very sad and vulnerable.
Yeah.
And what I do is I say, can you be really brave and make a move
Right.
to talk about their vulnerability?
Right.
What was that like when she noticed?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So I go back and forth. So now you at some point can notice their vulnerability. Can you look at her and tell her that right now? No.
Yeah.
All right, stay
So
with
then
me.
stay with you, right.
It's okay.
Right.
But let's see what we can do. A lot of times what you'll see in that is people won't have words
Right.
because they don't know a lot of their words.
don't know.
So I might say to them, if it were me, I might feel really abandoned and alone. That would scare me. Do you feel scared?
Right.
Can you tell them you're scared right now? So what happens is that we begin to get these two, rather than to go into dance, to go and really come for each other's vulnerability. A really amazing thing happens when that happens, when we do it. Something like this will happen. Somebody will say, you know what, I really want to tell you this right now, but that's that dance. What I'm recognizing is you're really hurting right now. And what I need to do is really go for that.
Yeah.
So you go into that, you start to get into stage 2, right? And then with the stage 2, we begin to say, okay, well, that enemy, that dance thing, and I usually have them name their dance, and I get some pretty funny names. But once you can really stay in stage 2, then you go to this natural step of resolving the issues. I have had people come in and they say, I cannot wait to argue this one out. And at the end of this, when we get into stage 2 and stuff, I'll say, what did you come in to argue? And they'll go, I can't remember what the fight was about. Because what you've done is you've gotten them to go to their attachment and their bonding, and once they feel safe with their person, they didn't need the dance. So emotion-focused therapy is in 3 stages, and usually what you try to do is to recognize the first, get to the second, and then help them negotiate step 3. And then what we do in that stage, there's kind of fancy words to that, which is kind of like pursuer softening. And what we do is we help people kind of ramp down, and I could get into the technicals of it, but basically what you're doing is getting them to kind of abandon the dance and go towards bonding with each other again.
Then there's another technique that involves eye movement, right? EMDR.
That's correct.
Tell us about that method.
Right. Well, it's funny because I had done EMDR and been trained in it somewhat before I changed my specialty in 2012. But what I found out was that the more I started doing marriage work, there was trauma. Now, remember I told you a little earlier about when people flood, right? So if people aren't traumatized and they flood, they're really out of their thinking brain. They're really into that reactive brain, right? So we need to get out of it. But what can happen is sometimes that occurs, trauma comes into the room. And what happens when trauma's in the room, you begin to, is this, what is this? Is this like flooding, or is something else happening that I don't understand? And their partner's like, I don't know anything about this. I don't know what to do, right? So one of the things that I did was I really went and not only got certified in EMDR, but I also got to where I was teaching, helping teach, and I do consultation now. I have people that call me up and I train them in how to do this, or I consult with them about their cases. So let me say real quick about what happens with trauma according to EMDR. Now I should say to folks, okay, one of the things that's really amazing, like I said, I can't speak highly enough about John and Julie Gottman, and one of the things that Julie has done in her life, you remember you asked me what I'm passionate about. My understanding with Julie is she started with trauma, emotional trauma. So she's developed a lot of methodology that is really highly effective, in order to intervene with marriages as it relates to trauma. So she's got this wonderful thing that she does with this. I'm aware of it, I can utilize that. Because I have the training in EMDR, I kind of go to what I use, which is that. But let me kind of try to explain what that kind of looks like to you. The first thing I say to people with regard to trauma is, don't worry about this making any sense. Trauma doesn't make sense, and I'm going to explain why it doesn't make sense. But don't try to figure this out. The other thing too is what traumatizes you may not traumatize me. Another thing that's fascinating about trauma is you can inherit genetics. Okay, my mother was French. She was 13 when the war broke out. My grandfather spent 5 years in a POW camp. Her mother and her 2-year-old brother were in Paris working at the post office. My uncle was an Appalachian Contrôlé winemaker of some means and had resources. So my mom and her older sister went to unoccupied France to a boarding school to keep them safe, right? Can you imagine?
All of that stays with you.
Right. But when I see Ukraine right now, it's activating me. And I've never been through that. But the genetics of what happened to them are my genetics. And this is an interesting science point too. That visits 4 generations. 4 generations. I was talking to Dan Siegel, and Dan had used an example in his own life. I hope he doesn't mind me giving that. But he said, my great-grandmother watched a Cossack soldier in Russia kill her husband while she was pregnant. The baby was genetically connected, right? Which was the grandmother. Okay, so the baby also has the genetics that go to his mom, and since he's one of the eggs, because it's female, those 4 generations are visited on his genetics from that. Well, I really relate to that with Russia and the Ukraine right now. I actually talk to my wife, because I can treat kids down to 0. I am actually trained in utero trauma. I said to Junko, I probably should be in Poland, getting 50 kids up and treating their trauma, because I'm one of the people that can do it. But part of why that comes to me is because, believe me, I'm upset because of my genetics. So trauma can also come with you even though you didn't experience trauma. So don't worry about it making sense. But here's what happens. Let's say, and I think statistically, 20% of the cases that come to marriage therapy involves infidelity. Well, if you have infidelity, I'm looking for post-traumatic stress disorder. I just am. I'm kind of assuming until I see otherwise, not the other way around.
It's this betrayal.
Well, plus it's your person, right? So I kind of have a joke I say to people that I really believe. I say, we are all 4-year-olds clinging to our mother's leg, afraid they're going to leave the mall and never come back. Well, this is 2.0. So now all of a sudden, you're really thinking mom's left the mall. And how could you leave the mall, right? So this can be traumatic.
You're not good enough,
Yeah, what you just said was a key symptom of trauma. And a lot of people don't know this, but what happens with trauma is we have a underlying belief system about ourselves that's negative. I'm not good enough. I'm bad. I should have done something. I deserve it. I'm going to die. All of these things begin. Now, that starts an algorithm. And what happens is as you go through life, when things happen, not only does it thread with the trauma, but it also reinforces the negative belief system. And this can follow you through your whole life. So it's very important that if there's trauma like this, we get rid of it. So what happens with the Emdr? So I'm just going to show you real quick. Just follow my fingers. Okay? So that's what it is. Or I can tap knees. But what you're doing is creating bilateral stimulation. So what happens in this bilateral stimulation is the left brain has to go to the right brain and the right brain has to go back, right? It crosses something in the brain that's got a fancy name called the corpus callosum. And what happens is when that all happens, it kind of pops the trauma like a champagne cork. So what we do first is we get the trauma back in the room. And we ask people, when this is happening, how much do you feel like you deserve it or you're bad? Oh, on a scale of 1 to 7, 7. Well then, how much do you feel like, I can control what I can, I'm good enough regardless, which may be their adaptive belief. Oh, I don't believe it at all. So what happens is we get this up and running, right? We get this up and running. But before we do it, I say, where do you feel it in your body? Because think about it. Let's say I'm in a car wreck, and right before the car wreck, I do this. Okay, that trauma might be trapped in the muscle. I got to get rid of that too. So what we begin to do is we begin to process that. That's what we call this movement. And we do it in such a way that eventually the brain starts to repair itself. So it's more medical, really, isn't it? It's not psychotherapy. So what can happen is we can start to say, well, wait a minute, that was a bad thing that happened then. But that was a long time ago. And now, looking back on it, well, wait a minute, I'm not that age at all. And yeah, that was a terrible thing that happened, but that was many years ago. Or in the case of the infidelity, well, wait a minute, that happened, but I am okay, and I can control what I can, and I'm not bad. And what I can do is work with Don to get back to that couples work and repair it. Because believe me, we in the Gottman methodology, we call it the atonement exercise. But it's really highly effective to repair that and get back to what we call attunement, right? Right, and then we get back to where we can, get to where the couple's back to where they are, and then they really work to not ever have those things happen again. So we're very successful in helping infidelity. A lot of times it's a symptom.
Yeah.
It's not an indictment of character. It's people are freaking out, so bad things happen. We can bring that back. But trauma is one of the ways that I can work to repair that so people don't continue to be re-traumatized, and they can get rid of that negative belief.
There's been demographic changes in marriage and relationships as well. Tell us about that.
Demographics. Well, I mean, there's people that are moving all over. We have demographic shifts where people are now working from Zoom. I myself, I live in Austin, but most of the people I see are in Ohio. I work with Zoom. I do go back fairly regularly to Ohio, especially due to the Emdr work.
Yeah.
But there are demographic changes. Yeah, I mean, I think, back to kind of where we were talking earlier, that people are adapting, and with that, our society needs to adapt. For example, what I noticed from the census stuff is people are living alone.
That's what you're saying,
lot more than they were. A lot more than they were.
Changed a lot since the 1950s to current, right?
It does. But here's an interesting statistic. If you're 55 and you're a male, and you're not in a relationship, it'll take 12 years off your life. Not women. Men. So, I mean, the idea of not being in a relationship, you don't know that you have to be married, but you have to have your person, right? So, I mean, those things are really important to pay attention to. We've noticed an uptick in suicidality, right? Well, we want to pay extra close attention to, what's going on. Remember during the pandemic, especially at the beginning, all of a sudden nobody had any dogs and cats in the animal shelters. People went,
adopted them,
and they needed something to love them and care. It's
unconditional
attachment.
love too.
Right.
What do you think about two other things I want to throw in, because they're more recent phenomenons in recent decades? Those dating sites, match this, match that,
Right.
or whatever, and finding your perfect partner on a dating site, and the influence and impact of social media on relationships,
Right.
marriages, dating, whatever, but just overall relationships, friendships, everything.
Yeah.
Those two things, maybe start with the dating sites first, and then talk about the influence of social media and all of this.
Well, one thing that, when you said that to me, one of the things that just came to my mind is growing pains. I remember we used to use this old expression, the Wild West, right? But the reality of it is it can be a really good thing, or it can be really not a good thing. For example, let's say, I'm going to make this up, let's say you're very religious, and you go to sites that really have the same kind of people that believe like you do, right? And from that, you have community, right? You might have community. So now all of a sudden, your church people might know them or something, but you get together. And those can be really nice. Then they have things like Ashley Madison, where married people hook up with married people, right? So that's a whole different kind of marriage site. But what we do find is some of this stuff kind of does fit our society and convenience. There are other kind of relationship sites, for example, where it's just for lunch. And you pay somebody and they have a database, or they have these really cool things now where you talk to them for 5 minutes and you shift and you go to somebody else.
Speed dating type stuff, yeah.
But what happens eventually is you find somebody you might like to go out again, right? And then what happens is we go from, yes, I found somebody, you know that feeling, right? That's called, I admire people's ability to make names up. It's funny. This is called limerence. It cracks me up, limerence. And what limerence is that, gee, it's great to be alive feeling. It's the Carpenter song, I'm on top of the world looking down on creation. That is limerence.
Yeah, the endorphins are flying high.
And your mating chemicals, by the way. This is like, let's get me on the planet fast.
Yeah.
But what happens is, through little things often, back to what I said earlier, what begins to happen is we start to build trust with that person, right? So let's say, for example, I really, I'm 20, I'm in college, and I finally got this woman to say she'll go out. And I'm like, yes, I'm telling everybody who cares to listen. And Friday comes around, I get no-showed. Right? But the next day I get a call, I am so sorry, and this was completely on me, and I feel terrible, give me another chance. So now I'm on top of the world again, aren't I? Right? But let's say if I go out with this person 20 times and she no-shows me 4 times. Now that's a trust thing. See, now it's little things often. Now it's building trust through consistent behavior. So when people, whether it's a dating app or whatever, one of the things that oftentimes happens is as you start to go out, as you start to learn about your person, do you want to be friends with that person? Do their habits, do their behaviors fit along things that I trust? Right? And if you do, and if you don't have a meth lab in the basement and everything's going great, well, then we get into commitment. That's when we go to the next step.
The next step.
And a lot of what happens with this is attunement. The little things often. There's a thing that we give to couples in the Gottman Institute called Little Things Often. And it's this crucial 5.5 hours during the week that you need to really do this. And it's what masters marriages do. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. A lot of this is based on attachment, like you said earlier, this need to feel accepted and attached to something or someone,
and
right?
it's medical.
It's medical.
It's medical. Your body, for its safety, we bond with other people. We bond with other people. And that's how we stay together, and that's how we're safe.
Is it true, sometimes people will say, in the beginning, you're always looking for the like-minded, the person who thinks like you, who reacts like you, who reinforces what your beliefs are and what your passions are. And then you get the other side of the fence that says, oh no, opposites attract. The fact that, he's got the yin and she's got the yang, and that's what brings it together, the opposite.
Yeah.
Is there a truth to any of that? Opposites attract, or it's better to search for somebody that gets you immediately, or
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting
there's no
thing.
true formula.
Well, first off, I'll go to medical. I always go to medical before I go to psychology. And what they found is if you meet somebody and you breathe them in and they breathe you in, the more dissimilar your pheromones, the more you'll be attracted to them. Because if you mate with them and have a baby, the differences in that make for a heartier child that can stave off more diseases. So that's one of the reasons you're attracted, and you don't even know. Sometimes what you're attracted to is it just they remind you of your family, or there is, for good or bad, by the way. So one of the things that can happen is you start to get together and connect. But the big question is, are you there for me? So when those turn towards happen, really what you're answering in 1/100th of a second slices is, are you there for me? When I reach for you, are you there? When I call for you, will you come? And back to Shrek, really, really. You know how Shrek in that one movie?
Yes.
He asked her, do you love me, Fiona? And she goes, well, of course I do, Shrek. And then he thought about it and he goes, really, really? That's where you make money in a movie. That's because Shrek risked everything. Shrek is a withdrawer, if you saw that movie.
Yeah.
He wants to get a bigger sign that says keep out.
About right.
But he bonded to Fiona. So now he's got a real mess. He's got a pickle. What am I going to do? Right.
So we talked about attune, the 4 S's, flooding, the 4 horsemen. And then there's the types of conflict. Tell us about that. I mean, does that must just run across the board, right?
Well, and again, a little bit to summarize, we have a dream within conflict, which is how to interview each other about understanding beliefs. We have the rapport and we have the regrettable incident. That's a lot of times needs and feelings. You know, this is how I feel. What I need from you is this, right? And then, you know, again, don't describe your partner, describe what you need, right? So you have those, you know, the other thing we have is something called the compromise ovals. So once we really understand our person, now we say, okay, these areas I'm willing to yield on, these areas I'm not. So let's, you know, we have a exercise that gets us to yes. What you find, at least what I find in my practice, is that a lot of times these areas of inflexibility aren't, I want 10 kids, I don't want any. What it is that, you know, back to that, I want you to go to church every Sunday. Well, you know, I'm flexible on that. They're not yielding, I want you to go to church. But you know, I might be willing to go sometimes. Now, I will tell you, this is a true story actually. My mom really believed, that the reason that France was liberated was because Jesus sent the Americans to liberate France. And not to put too fine a point on it for her, but that reunited her whole family. Now think about that. So she really felt, to honor Jesus, all of her kids have to be Catholic, they have to go to Catholic school, they have to go to church every Sunday. So my mom, all of her life, used to angle to try to get me to go. But one of the areas of flexibility is, Mom, when I come in to see you, we are going to go to church and I'll go with you and we'll have a nice time. And then we come back and Dad's going to make breakfast and we'll have a nice breakfast and we'll have a whole Sunday morning like that. It really meant a lot to my mother, right? And to this day, I mean, I still not only absorb her, but I absorbed my grandmother. She was very Southern Baptist, right? So I can go to a Southern Baptist place and I really enjoy church, but I don't go like I did when I was in 1973. I was an altar boy. Good golly, I used to do 8 masses in a week. You know, it was fun and it taught me so much about being up in front of people like we are now. I mean, there's so many blessings that happened as a result of that.
And
yeah, so I'm very grateful for all of that. But for my mom, she wouldn't yield, but we were able to reach an area of flexibility. So these are our, you know, ways of kind of managing conflict, and then right back to building friendship.
The other thing that you touched upon, which is a very big part of your work, is dealing with folks who have gone through various levels of trauma. And sometimes people get into a relationship because they see that other person as being able to save them from the trauma, soften the trauma, maybe even mask the trauma, because that other person has this bubbly, you know, buoyant personality, which can be infectious. Sometimes on the flip side, that other person who is buoyant and so has such a great up personality is attracted to the fact that that other person is wounded and has trauma, and they feel that they're going to be able, one of the things that attracts them is they're going to be able to sort of correct or erase the trauma for them. And the relationship is being based on one is the savior and the other one is the victim that needs to be saved, and they start things out that way. That could be a difficult thing.
Yeah, somebody once, I don't know who it was, but somebody described it as the unwritten marriage contract.
Like one's the martyr.
Right, well, let's have some fun with what you just said. Let's just kind of take that. So what happens if this person's trauma is to be rescued and this person's trauma is, if I can't rescue, I'm no good, rotten, worthless? So now all of a sudden, when the 69% perpetual problems happen, all of a sudden it causes the trauma to come up. Now, one thing I want to say about trauma is trauma floats. Okay, so what happens is if something is so overwhelming to me, what my mind does, and this is just a way to describe it, it's not literal, but what happens is my mind takes all of that and pushes it off to the side. It doesn't process it. So what we call that is fragmented neural networks. So they're floating. So if I ask you and you have one of those things going on, it's not uncommon for me to hear kind of muttering. So tell me about what happened. Well, I was kind of doing this and well, you know, that kind of, and it sounds like that because what they're doing is they're trying to think through the fragmented neural networks, right? So there's no cohesive narrative. So now when you get a couple doing that, all of a sudden they're back in the moment. I wasn't rescued. You're just like the person who never rescued me. I'm alone. And it's all try to make sense of a lot of the trauma. Yeah. So, we do have the methodology that can really help with that. But PTSD work would really help, because what happens a lot of times when you process it is people kind of have these fragmented neural networks become a cohesive narrative, and then your mind kind of does Tetris, where it puts it where it belongs. So let's say, because we're doing public speaking now, so let's say in 9th grade I went up in front of everybody in my speech class, and everybody laughed at me and I was humiliated, right? So now, I want to go out and I want to talk to Jim, and I'm terrified, I panic. So one of the things that might happen when we do the EMDR work is I would bring that up. Okay, now imagine you on stage imagining this happening, right? So now I start processing, right? So I say, now whatever comes up, whatever you think about, just notice it. So all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, but then it kind of goes away. Oh, I remember another one. Goes away. Oh, another one. But now this is what happens. All of a sudden, I'm being general here, of course, but now all of a sudden what happens is like, oh, well, wait a minute, Jim. Well, what do you mean, wait a minute? Well, wait a minute. You know what? I kind of remember that now. What happened is that I thought I could just go on stage and wing it. And I told my friends. And all of a sudden I got up there and everybody realized I wasn't prepared. And they were laughing. But I don't think my friends were laughing at me. Matter of fact, I would have laughed at them. But I think that what happened is that we just realized that I was up there and I wasn't prepared. Okay, all right. So what about going forward? What about going forward? Well, I'm going to be as good as I can if I do something, but, if I practice and rehearse, or I get somebody who knows kind of what they're doing, I think I could learn how to do it, and I certainly know how to prepare. And now that I'm prepared, I really think I can do this. Do you hear the difference in the trauma thoughts? Because the trauma thoughts were, I can't do this because I'm stupid. I can't do this because, everybody's going to see that I'm incompetent and they're going to make fun of me. And it goes from that to, well, I'm who I am and I can take reasonable steps to do this. And yeah, maybe I'll succeed or maybe I won't, but I'm still me. And by the way, that was 9th grade me. You remember yourself in 9th grade? Oh my gosh, everything was, so spotlight on you. And that's not me now. So now all of a sudden you have context. Time begins to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And then that experience becomes a 9th grade experience that just goes into your today's consciousness, and it just gets assimilated. So now your brain starts to open up to where you can be more spontaneous, you can take more risks, you can be happy, you can laugh, and well, we'll give it a shot and see how it goes. So that's where EMDR can really help people. And once you get rid of that in a marriage, well, now either it's EFT to really look at how that was manifesting in the dance, or with the Gottman stuff, let's begin to talk about your needs and wants, and let's do this in a way that you feel closer. And then let's get back to building that friendship house without some of those things. So some of that codependency you were talking about earlier just isn't relevant anymore, because now you can talk in a way that you can feel safe and connected.
Let's talk about some of the ways that you facilitate all of this. You do these incredible workshops, right?
That's really a cool thing about the Gottman Method. Now, again, I don't do EFT. I really have not done a lot of public speaking with EMDR because I'm so busy with the other stuff. But I do know if people talk to me, I can tell them who to go to get training or go to one of these things. But one of the things about the Gottman Method is I am certified in Gottman Method. But I'm really proud to tell you that they have invited me to be something called a master trainer. And there's just a handful of us. And what we do is, now, for example, I can teach the 3 levels of the Gottman Method to clinicians. And then when they're ready to go on to be certified, I can actually consult with them to bring them to certification and help them master 4 videos of what we just talked about, right? Like flooding, 4 horsemen. So now I'm able to do that. As a matter of fact, in 2 weeks, I'm in Pittsburgh. We've got a group of 42 people. I can't wait, and we're going to do the level 1 training. And hopefully some of those people will want to go on and continue with this incredible method. And I've done a lot of public speaking. I just finished talking to the Navy with a level 2 training in Washington, D.C. And, back to really giving people skill sets so that they can go out to the community, which is really my mission. I mean, I appreciate all of this, but to me, and I know when I talk to the people at the Institute, I mean, our main focus is getting couples to have a high-functioning relationship. So you can see what goes into this, but at the end of the day, it's to bring the good news and the good techniques to people. So yes, I do. I am a master trainer, and I do a lot of public speaking. The other thing that's important is, let's say your marriage is going along, but you'd like to learn the Gottman Method. Next week in Austin, I'm doing an art and science of love. Now, we also do 7 principles. We do bringing baby home. We have a lot of different ways that couples in a certain area can go and spend an entire weekend learning all this. And when they're doing this, they can raise their hand, and somebody like me can come over and be right on the spot and help them. It's educational. It's not psychotherapeutic. And for some, they may say, look, after getting all this, maybe we could use some counseling, or maybe we could let Don watch our marriage in particular and really fine-tune these techniques to us. But the Institute has been doing so much more. The other thing I have to say, and this is kind of a plug, but it's very important, the Gottman Institute just invented something called the Gottman Connect and the Gottman Builder. So people can go to the Institute and they can take what we're doing today and they can click on films and actually watch John and Julie enact these, right? Now, what I find is, for me, I will help a couple and then I'll assign that, and then they can take and see that and come back and give me more questions. So it's just a way to be more aware of it. Now, what I find is some people like my book. They like to do things by the book, and they don't want to watch a video. Some people really, in this day and age with blogs and podcasts and everything, they want to go watch and see John and Julie do it. So that's available for people now. And I'm just really impressed at the amount of effort that they have really done to make this available for people. It's exciting, and it just shows you how much love John and Julie have, and the Institute has for couples, and it doesn't matter whether they're married, a relationship. It doesn't matter, gender stuff. We take a lot of time and care to research as many things as we can.
You're so well versed in all of this, and obviously very passionate, and you love what you do. What brings you such great blessing and joy in doing all of this work?
I think the satisfaction of watching people. I mean, from an existential point of view, and I remember this from school, and this from school teachers. If you teach a class in 3rd grade, you have touched so many people, not just today with that 3rd grader, but their whole life. Yeah. And if I can help repair a marriage, and we do have technology that works. I mean, this stuff really works. Right? I mean, I remember, that's one thing great about being older, is I remember how we used to treat marriages in the 80s. And I remember, this was before me, but in the 60s, what they used to do. Right? In the 60s, they, for example, used to have a thing called quid pro quo. So what they would do in couples work is they'd say, you do this and you do that. But we found it built resentments. Well, wait a minute, I took the trash out. Why didn't you do the dishes?
Right.
So it didn't work. And then with Murray Bowen's work, and I remember studying this in school, he was kind of, and listen, I don't mean to knock him, I like him and I like his techniques, but his philosophy was you don't need feelings, you just need, okay, let's hammer this out. What the Gottman research realized is that feelings create hierarchy in what's important. So feelings are extremely important. And then Sue Johnson, that's all she does. So see the evolution back to what I said earlier.
Yeah.
Nowadays, we have so much more to help young couples and older couples and everybody in between really have the relationship they really wanted, and nobody has taught them.
Right.
Nobody's taught. Who taught this? Well, I didn't learn this.
Right.
Right. So yeah.
Really a pleasure having you come to the Close-Up Television Studios, Doctor.
Yeah.
Really, again, you're so passionate, well-versed, but you care, and you're very empathetic, and you really, truly want to help people, which I think is what drives you to continue doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
And the radio shows we did were spectacular, but having you actually come here and break this out and really give us incredible examples and things we can even apply to our lives right now is extraordinary. And I encourage folks to make connection with you to learn more.
Right. Well, I'm at donallenphd.com, right? And
Exactly.
my wife actually does my website. I'm very proud of her. and she's really done amazing things. But it's DONALLEN PhD, right?
Very easy.
Yeah.
Did you enjoy yourself?
You know, I got to tell you again, it's just fun hanging out with you for an hour. I've been looking forward to seeing you and talking.
It's a conversation, not an interview. It's a conversation.
It's amazing. So I'm pleased that we had a chance to do this, and I hope that this is something that people listen to and know. You don't have to come to Don. We're all over the United States, and there's EFT people, and there's Gottman, and there's Emdr, there's EMDR people. And listen, if you're having trouble, there's hope. We really, really, really can make a difference in people's lives. So I hope they see this and say, I'm gonna figure this out. So
put one foot in front of the other and make that move, because it's so important. Because one of the greatest investments you can make is in yourself and in each other, right?
Yeah. Well, it's evolutionary. I mean, your major source of safety, security, and comfort is the people that you bond with. And if you don't have those bonds, you can do it, but it's harder.
Yeah.
It's harder. And people are meant to be in connected relationships.
It's been a pleasure, my friend.
It's been fun. And again, we'll have to do this again.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Best of luck.
It. Yeah, you too. You too.
Thank you.
As you can see, Dr. Allen loves what he does, and what he does is nothing short of extraordinary. If you'd like to learn more, visit this website, donallenphd.com. For Close-Up Television and Radio, I'm Jim Masters. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again next time.